In this video, we will discuss the context of the letters to the Corinthians. When we talk about the letters to the Corinthians, we're talking about 1st and 2nd Corinthians that we see in the New Testament. By most scholars' accounts, Paul the Apostle actually wrote both 1st and 2nd Corinthians. More than likely, he wrote these letters during his time in Ephesus, although 2nd Corinthians may have been written from Macedonia, perhaps while he was traveling from Ephesus to Corinth. These texts are usually dated to about 54 to 55 CE, 1 Corinthians being written toward the beginning of this time, while 2 Corinthians was probably written in around 55 CE. Unlike some of the other letters we see that are addressed to individuals or general groups of Christians, the letters to the Corinthians are addressed to specific church or church community at Corinth. Now remember that Corinth is a Greek city at this point. While we do have Jewish Christians who are part of this community, we also have many Gentile Christians as well. Paul writes these letters to a group who seem to be, at least in 1 Corinthians, confused about what Christianity entails and misunderstand Paul's previous teachings. And a lot of this is probably because of their involvement in the Greek community. He responds to some of their concerns that they write to him in a letter, and responds to these issues, which we'll look at in the next slide. Paul also discusses Timothy. The audience of 2 Corinthians seemed to have mistreated Timothy, who Paul had sent to them earlier. And the audience also questions what apostles should act like, so Paul responds to this issue. In 1 Corinthians, we have Paul responding to a letter that the Corinthian church sent to Paul, along with a report that Chloe's people, and Chloe seems to be a person who is the leader of the church community, or at least somebody high up in that church community. And one of the key concerns here is with immorality. Now, the immorality that we see addressed in 1st and 2nd Corinthians is primarily sexual immorality. Corinth was pretty notable for being a place of Greco-Roman temples at this point, which contained gods and goddesses who would be sacrificed to, as well as temple prostitutes who would be used for religious ceremonies. The church that we see in both of these texts is not necessarily questioning how to be a Christian because they don't understand Paul's teachings, but because they live in a very important Greek city, which was notable for its temple and sacrifices to the gods, as well as prostitution. One of the issues we see in 1 Corinthians, which is addressed relatively early on, is a man living with his father's wife, presumably his stepmother. Paul addresses concerns like this in the text to explain ways that these Christians are supposed to separate themselves from what's going on in the larger city of Corinth. One of the other issues is with idolatry. Now, Paul addresses idolatry not in the sense of not worshiping other gods, but not to even eat meat that's offered to these other gods. In Corinth, as I noted, the temple was very important, and there would be marketplaces where people would sell meat offered to the gods, or meat that had already been offered. Paul says that Christians should not eat this meat at all because of this notion that it's already been sacrificed. One of the key issues that we see in 1 Corinthians is with the denial of future Christian resurrection. Paul addresses this issue in 1 Corinthians primarily because people in Corinth were arguing that there was no resurrection in the future. In 2 Corinthians, we see Paul respond to Titus's report of how Timothy was mistreated by the church, and Paul calls for the person or people who abused Timothy to be punished. And Paul especially explains what apostleship means and how Paul was truly an apostle, because people were accusing him of not being one, since he did not ask or accept money from the people of Corinth, like some of the false apostles, as he claims, did when they were traveling. One thing that's important to know about 1st and 2nd Corinthians is they are not the only letters that Paul wrote to the Corinthian church. 1st and 2nd Corinthians are two of at least 4 letters that Paul sent to the church at Corinth. This can be determined because Paul references a previous message to Corinth in 1 Corinthians, which would then be his 2nd letter, and another letter that he references in 2 Corinthians, which would then be his 4th letter. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to explain the authorship, composition date, audience, and authorial intent of the letters to the Corinthians, describe the historical setting and context of the letters to the Corinthians, and identify the themes in the letters to the Corinthians and give examples of how they are used in the text.